The year was 1968. Deep in the Vietnamese jungle, an American Green Beret named John Stryker Meyer crouched motionless in elephant grass for 6 straight hours. Not a muscle moved, not a sound escaped. Around him, North Vietnamese soldiers passed within arm's reach, never knowing death waited inches away. When his Vietnamese teammate finally whispered, "Beaucoup VC," Meyer had already counted 47 enemy fighters, but this wasn't just exceptional soldiering. This was something else entirely. This was a fundamental transformation in how humans could exist in one of Earth's most hostile environments. What Meyer and thousands of other special operations soldiers discovered in the jungles of Vietnam would rewrite the rules of warfare. They learned that the jungle wasn't their enemy, it was their weapon, but the cost of this transformation would haunt many of them for the rest of their lives. The American military machine that rolled into Vietnam in the 1960s was built for a very different kind of war. Massive formations, overwhelming firepower, technological superiority, these were the pillars of American military doctrine. The Army was trained and equipped for mechanized warfare on the plains of Europe, not guerrilla combat in triple canopy jungle, where visibility extended barely 10 meters. The early results were devastating. Conventional units stumbled through the jungle like blind giants, announcing their presence hours before they arrived. Equipment failed in the humidity. Soldiers succumbed to diseases they'd never heard of. Most critically, they were fighting an enemy who had lived in these jungles for generations, who knew every trail, every hiding place, every natural advantage the terrain could offer. The North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong didn't just fight in the jungle. They were part of it. They moved like water through bamboo thickets. They vanished into vegetation that seemed impenetrable to American eyes. They struck without warning and disappeared before their enemies could respond. The jungle was their ally, and the Americans were fighting both. By 1967, it became clear that conventional tactics weren't working. The Pentagon needed something different. They needed soldiers who could match the enemy on their own terms. They needed warriors who could become one with the jungle itself. The answer came in the form of highly classified special operations units, primarily the Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, MAC-VSOG. These weren't conventional soldiers adapted for jungle work. These were operators specifically selected and trained for a complete psychological and physical transformation. The selection process alone eliminated 90% of candidates, but those who survived weren't just physically capable, they had demonstrated something rarer. They possessed what psychologists would later term environmental adaptability, the mental flexibility to abandon everything they thought they knew about being human in a hostile environment. The transformation began with something SOG operators called sterilization. This wasn't just about removing unit patches or dog tags for plausible deniability. This was about systematically eliminating every trace of civilized behavior that could betray their presence. Every piece of equipment was examined for noise. Metal was wrapped in tape. Buckles were replaced with silent alternatives. Canteens were filled completely to prevent sloshing. Even toothbrushes were cut down to eliminate unnecessary bulk. But the physical preparation was just the beginning. The real transformation was psychological. For the final 12 hours before insertion, SOG teams observed complete silence. No talking, no whispering, no unnecessary movement. They were conditioning their bodies and minds to operate without the social behaviors that defined human civilization. Former SOG operator John Stryker Meyer described the process. You weren't just preparing for a mission. You were becoming something else, something that could exist in that green hell without fighting it. What separated SOG operators from conventional soldiers wasn't just training, it was a fundamental shift in consciousness. They learned to think like predators rather than soldiers. Conventional troops moved through terrain trying to dominate it. SOG operators learned to flow with it, to read its rhythms, to become part of its natural patterns. This meant developing senses most humans never use. After months of jungle operations, veteran SOG operators could identify human presence through smell alone, the scent of soap, tobacco, or different diets carried on the wind. They could detect the subtle sound patterns that indicated approaching enemy forces. Most remarkably, they developed what could only be described as jungle intuition, the ability to sense danger through environmental cues too subtle for conscious recognition. Aboriginal trackers attached to Australian SAS units provided the template for this transformation. These men brought tracking skills refined over 40,000 years of survival in hostile terrain. They could read a jungle floor like Americans read newspapers. A bent twig revealed not just that someone had passed, but when, how heavy their load was, and whether they were moving with purpose or caution. American Special Operations units began incorporating these ancient techniques. SOG operators learned to track individual enemy soldiers across terrain that conventional forces considered trackless. They could determine how many fighters had used a trail, what weapons they carried, and whether they were moving toward or away from contact. But learning to read the jungle was only half the transformation. The other half was learning to become invisible within it. Camouflage for SOG operators went far beyond wearing the right uniform. They learned to move their bodies in ways that mimicked natural jungle rhythms. They studied how animals moved through vegetation without disturbing it. They practiced remaining motionless for hours while insects crawled across their skin and leeches attached to their arms. The most advanced practitioners could pass within meters of enemy positions without detection. They moved inches at a time, timing each movement with wind patterns or the sounds of jungle wildlife. Their breathing became controlled to minimize sound. Their pulse slowed to reduce body heat signatures. John Stryker Meyer recalled one mission where his team observed a North Vietnamese supply convoy for 18 hours from a position just 15 meters away. "We were so close I could smell their cigarettes," he said, "but we might as well have been on the moon for all they knew we existed." This level of integration with the environment came at a psychological cost. Many SOG veterans reported that the line between their human identity and their jungle persona began to blur. They found themselves more comfortable in the hostile jungle environment than in rear areas with other soldiers. Some struggled to maintain normal human relationships and social behaviors. The most effective jungle operators developed what could only be described as a predatory mindset. They stopped thinking about the enemy as fellow humans engaged in combat and began viewing them as prey to be hunted. This psychological shift was both necessary for survival and deeply troubling for many who experienced it. Former Green Beret Dick Meadows, who worked extensively with SOG units, observed, "You could see it in their eyes when they came back from long missions. They'd been somewhere the rest of us couldn't follow, and part of them never really came back." The tactical advantages of this transformation were undeniable. SOG teams achieved casualty ratios that seemed impossible by conventional standards, in some documented cases exceeding 150 enemy kills for every American loss. They gathered intelligence that conventional units couldn't obtain. They conducted sabotage operations deep behind enemy lines that disrupted North Vietnamese logistics for months. But perhaps most importantly, they turned the psychological advantage of the jungle back against its traditional masters. For the first time in decades, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces found themselves being hunted by an enemy who moved through their domain better than they did. Captured enemy documents revealed the psychological impact of these operations. North Vietnamese commanders reported troops refusing patrol duty in areas where SOG teams had been active. The enemy began referring to these American operators as forest ghosts, spirits who appeared from nowhere and vanished without trace. One captured Vietnamese officer's statement summarized the shift. "We have always owned the jungle. Now the jungle has new masters, and we are afraid." The training methods that produced these results were closely guarded throughout the war and for decades afterward. Much of what is known comes from declassified documents and the memoirs of veterans who were finally able to speak about their experiences after their non-disclosure agreements expired. Training began at specialized schools where candidates learned not just jungle survival, but jungle mastery. They studied animal behavior to understand natural movement patterns. They learned botany to identify edible plants and natural camouflage materials. They practiced navigation techniques that relied on environmental cues rather than maps and compasses. Most critically, they underwent psychological conditioning designed to break down the mental barriers that separated them from their environment. Instructors used sensory deprivation, extended periods of isolation, and carefully controlled stress to push candidates beyond their normal psychological limits. The goal wasn't to create super soldiers in the conventional sense, it was to produce human beings who could exist comfortably in an environment that would drive most people insane within days. This transformation had consequences that extended far beyond individual combat effectiveness. Teams that successfully internalized jungle warfare philosophy developed an almost telepathic level of coordination. They could communicate complex tactical concepts through eye contact alone. They moved as a single organism rather than a collection of individuals. John Stryker Meyer described the sensation. After months of operating together, we stopped being 6 separate people. We became something new, a jungle creature that happened to be made up of human parts. This level of unit cohesion produced tactical results that seemed supernatural to outside observers. SOG teams could coordinate complex ambushes without radio communication. They could execute intricate maneuvers in zero visibility conditions. They anticipated each other's actions with accuracy that defied logical explanation. The enemy noticed this unusual coordination and began developing countermeasures specifically designed to break up these highly integrated units. They would target individual team members not to inflict casualties, but to disrupt the psychological bonds that made the team so effective. The broader implications of jungle warfare philosophy extended beyond special operations. Conventional units that adopted even simplified versions of these techniques showed marked improvements in jungle effectiveness. The emphasis on patience, environmental awareness, and psychological adaptation proved valuable for any soldier operating in hostile terrain. However, the full transformation required a level of psychological commitment that most conventional soldiers couldn't or wouldn't make. The process of becoming truly integrated with a jungle environment demanded abandoning fundamental aspects of civilized behavior and social conditioning. Many SOG veterans struggled with the transition back to normal military service, let alone civilian life. They had spent months or years in a mental state that prioritized survival over social norms, predatory instincts over human empathy, and environmental integration over human relationships. Some found it impossible to sleep indoors. Others became hypervigilant in civilian environments, unable to relax their senses enough to function in normal social situations. A significant number required years of psychological counseling to readjust to peacetime life. The long-term psychological effects of jungle warfare transformation became the subject of extensive but classified military research. Studies conducted by Army psychologists in the 1970s revealed that extended jungle operations produced measurable changes in brain chemistry and sensory processing. Operators who had undergone complete jungle integration showed enhanced spatial awareness, improved pattern recognition, and heightened sensory acuity that persisted for years after their service ended. However, these same individuals often displayed reduced empathy, difficulty with abstract reasoning, and challenges forming normal social relationships. The research raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of human adaptability and the costs of pushing soldiers beyond conventional psychological limits. The findings contributed to changes in special operations training that emphasized gradual adaptation rather than total transformation. By the end of the Vietnam War, the jungle warfare philosophy had spread throughout American Special Operations Forces. Units like Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, and Marine Force Reconnaissance incorporated environmental integration techniques into their training programs. However, the full psychological transformation practiced by SOG units was quietly abandoned. Military leadership concluded that the tactical advantages, while significant, came at too high a personal cost for the operators involved. The legacy of Vietnam jungle warfare philosophy continues to influence modern special operations training. Current programs emphasize environmental awareness, patience, and integration with local terrain and culture. However, the emphasis has shifted toward maintaining psychological stability rather than pursuing complete environmental transformation. Modern operators learn to use the environment as a tool rather than becoming indistinguishable from it. They develop enhanced sensory awareness without abandoning their human identity. They practice patience and observation without losing the ability to function in conventional military and social environments. The veterans who underwent the complete jungle transformation remain a unique group in military history. They achieved levels of environmental integration that may never be replicated or, given what is now known about the psychological costs, ever attempted again. Their experiences provide invaluable insights into human adaptability and the relationship between consciousness and environment. They demonstrated that humans can adapt to hostile environments in ways that seemed impossible before Vietnam. But their experiences also serve as a warning about the limits of human psychological plasticity. The jungle made them incredibly effective soldiers, but it also changed them in ways that proved irreversible for many. John Stryker Meyer, reflecting on his transformation decades after the war, offered this perspective. We learned that humans can become anything the environment demands, but we also learned that some changes come at a price you can't calculate until it's too late to change your mind. The jungle warfare philosophy of "we don't fight the jungle, we become it" represented both the pinnacle of human environmental adaptation and a cautionary tale about the costs of abandoning human nature in the pursuit of tactical advantage. The operators who embodied this philosophy saved countless lives through their extraordinary effectiveness. They gathered intelligence that shaped the course of the war. They conducted missions that conventional forces couldn't attempt. But they also paid a personal price that the military is still struggling to understand. They became something new, creatures perfectly adapted to one of Earth's most hostile environments. Whether they remained fully human in the process is a question that haunts military psychology to this day. The jungle kept its promise. Those who truly became part of it gained almost supernatural abilities, but the jungle extracted payment for its gifts, and for many, the cost was nothing less than their original selves. In the end, the philosophy succeeded too well. It created warriors so perfectly adapted to their environment that they could never fully return to the world they had fought to defend. They became the jungle, and the jungle became them, forever.